And so I will try to keep this brief because I always want these to be very brief and not burdensome on folks and have some time for discussion. Obviously, we are starting very late today, but I'll try to be as brief as possible. This is one that came to my mind because of my background in psychology, and games people play, of course, is not my term. It's based on the best-selling book that came out in 1964, and so that's what prompted me to think about it because it's the 50th anniversary, and it's by this psychiatrist, Eric Berne. You can see he only lived until 1970. The book came out in 64. It was the bestseller that launched his fame and his brand or version of psychiatry. And at that time, of course, psychiatry did not have effective medications, and so psychiatrists were trained in psychoanalytic perspectives, primarily Freudian kinds of perspectives. So with that background, he considered himself a social psychiatrist and was more interested in how people interacted and how they communicated. And so certainly, I think we'll see some influence here from Freud, but he was really much more concrete and much more focused on conscious and observable kinds of behaviors. And so you see the cover there of the best-selling book. Started what became known as transactional analysis, or TA, and grew in popularity throughout the 60s. I would say it hit its peak in popularity in the 1970s after his death. And at that time, there were graduate programs you could go to get a degree in psychology that happened to specialize in TA, or transactional analysis. There are still some folks out there that consider themselves transactional analysts, but very few. But certainly a long legacy there. That's the cover of the book. It has since sold over 5 million copies. Still around, still in print. Oops, we're losing connection here. There we go. And basically, in a nutshell, this is the diagram for how he would analyze transactions among people. Now, these circles represent two people in some kind of interaction or communication. And his point was that each of us have aspects of our personality that he would label parent, adult, and child. Now, if you've had any exposure to Freudian kinds of things, that might look familiar because you could make the analogy there that the adult is the ego, the parent is the superego, and the child is the id, from the old id, ego, and superego. Although, again, his was much more conscious. And so there's no research behind this. It's purely a model, a way of thinking about how people interact. And again, it gets more complex, and that's why they have entire degree programs and several books about TA. But in a nutshell, the idea is when two people interact, we could analyze which aspect of their personality is that communication coming from. And so we see on the left there, the one person is initiating an adult conversation. So that person might ask a very rational question like, do you know what the temperature is going to be tomorrow? Now, if the other person responds from his or her adult, they would answer objectively and say, I heard it's going to be 64 degrees or whatever. And so that would be very adult. If, however, the second person says, it's going to be cold out tomorrow, just make sure you wear your coat, then he would say, well, that sounds like the parent part of them is responding to the child and the other person, right? Because they're sort of treating the other person like a child who needs a parental response. And so you have complementary interactions, like from parent to child or child to parent, or adult to adult. But we can see that when they're crossed like this is when you have the potential for miscommunication or hurt feelings or whatever, because really they're not interacting at the same level, the same underlying psychology. And of course, there's all different possible combinations. He also points out that we have lots of social rituals. So before we get to games, we want to recognize that not everything is a game. Sometimes there's very basic. A very common one, of course, is to be walking down the hall and hear somebody say, oh, hey, how was your weekend? And the other person says, good, how about yours? Right? So very ritualized. We've all done this a million times. We all know what to expect. So then the question is, what is the purpose or the payoff from a psychology perspective? What do you think people get from, we do this all the time, so what do we maybe get from these kinds of little ritualized interactions? What do you think?
Grooming.
I'm sorry?
It's grooming.
It's grooming, right? So he would say, and he actually...
We're friends.
It's actually...
You stroke your back.
He uses the word stroke, absolutely. He'd say that we no longer groom each other physically, but we mentally, or we verbally, symbolically groom each other by having these interactions. And so he does use that word, groom or stroke or whatever, and says that we need that kind of social recognition. And so in this exchange, it's an even exchange. One person is recognizing the other person is recognizing back. Now we can imagine, of course, the first person says, how's your weekend? And the other person just ignores that person walks right on by, there's probably going to be some hurt feelings, right? And the first person's going to wonder, what did I do wrong, or what's wrong with that person? Or what if the first person says, how's your weekend? And the second says, oh, let me tell you, Saturday I had a hard time getting to sleep, and so then and they go into this long story. Well, that's breaking convention. I would just give you a quick stroke, and I expected one in return, and now you're not living up to your end of the social contract by giving me that stroke. So partly we get those recognitions, that social recognition that we need, but also it just helps to say, hey, we're on the same page, we follow the same conventions, we follow the same rules, you know how to play, I know how to play. And he made the distinction between these little rituals and maybe a little bit more elaborate forms that he called social pastimes. And this is oftentimes seen when you see people in pairs or in small groups, the cocktail parties and barbecues or at work or whatever. And so we basically have little extended versions of social rituals. There are tons of common ones. You might recognize, weather. Now, obviously, if I say, hey, it sure is warm out there, sure is, well, that's probably more of just a little social ritual. But we can build that out, and we can talk about how unusual the weather is right now. And back in 1972, I remember a time, right? And we can extend this into sort of an ongoing little pastime where we have quite a little discussion about weather. Another common example might be husbands. When you get certain wives together, they might all compare notes about, you can't expect husbands to, let me tell you what my husband did the other day, right? And so you have sort of this ongoing little ritual around it. Or ain't it awful can be applied to lots of things, right? Where you say, isn't it awful about violence in television nowadays? Or isn't it awful when you see kids and their pants are hanging down around their, whatever the case might be, we talk about, isn't it awful that this is the case? So let's consider for a moment, what might we as humans get from these little more extended interactions? Because we have to agree they're not very useful in the sense of information, right? We're not really learning anything new. I mean, they're very ritualized, very predictable.
Just to break the silence?
So it structures our time, doesn't it? It gives us something to talk about. It's something safe and conventional and predictable to talk about so that we get to interact but not really have to, like say, think about it that much or expose much about ourselves. And it breaks the silence and makes everyone comfortable. And so at that level, if somebody doesn't play or doesn't know how to play, that makes us uncomfortable. And maybe there's a group that are all playing husbands over in the corner, and another woman joins them and suddenly switches the topic to something else. Well, the other women in the group may not take very kindly to that. We were playing husbands over here. You came over here and tried to switch it to the weather or whatever. And so again, the idea that it does convey that, hey, you're one of us. You know how to play. You're willing to play nicely. You're willing to go along with us. So these are all pretty benign and just ways that we structure the time and get social interaction. And then, of course, he distinguishes this last level as more complex and distinguishes games as, again, they're ritualized and they're social, but there's now an ulterior motive. There's often a dishonesty in terms of what people are looking to get from them. And so this is where oftentimes there are more dramatic or emotional displays. People get more likely to get hurt feelings, more likely to feel caught off guard or have some kind of surprise that they don't like. So then we have to question again, what do people get from these games? And this is where it might shade into psychopathology, is that for the one part, we get to express our parent or our child. So he would say that we all need to express the parental and child aspects of ourselves. Now, we didn't really distinguish earlier that there are different aspects of the child. We could say there's the naive, innocent, playful child. There's the irresponsible child. There's the child that needs taken care of, and so forth. Just like with parents, there's the nurturing side of our parent being, there's the critical side of our parent being, and that, yes, we can express these sometimes in little interactions, but it's really in games that we might get to fully express these or have some emotional expression behind them that would be cathartic or that would give folks, some sense of satisfaction. But to take it even a little bit further and maybe to shade into some form of psychopathology, some folks, he says, are following certain, he called them sometimes life positions, at other times he called them scripts, but the idea that some people have taken on a life position or an existential position about their life, that now they feel the need, now this is not conscious, but they feel the need to repeat and they feel the need to reinforce and gather data to support that, yes, indeed, this is the way life is, or this is the way people see me, or so forth. So we can see that, again, there's that ulterior payoff. On the surface, it looks like we're just talking with each other about benign things, but maybe underneath, there are some more emotional issues going on or some other needs that are deeper that are being met. So a very common example, and we'll talk through a few different examples, a very common one, we've all been in social gatherings like at a party or whatever, and somebody says, yeah, I've got a problem. You know, my kid won't stay asleep at night. Or, you know, I've got a problem. My husband tends to do this. Or my coworker tends to do it. My boss tends to, we present some problem. Now, we've all been in those social circles where somebody presents a problem. What do the rest of us tend to then do when somebody says, oh, I've got a problem?
Fix it.
Oh, have you tried such and such, right? Because we assume on the surface that the person is looking for solutions or looking for help, and we want to be helpful. Now, if we go back a second, though, what aspect is the person initiating from, the parent, adult, or child, when they say, oh, I've got a problem?
It's not clear.
It's not clear. Now, if they really do have a problem and they're looking for solutions, there's probably an adult, right? They're like, hey, I've got a problem. I know you're an expert. Will you help me with? That's probably an adult asking for an adult response. Mm-hmm. But if it's a game, they're probably responding from their child, right? I have a problem. Take care of me. You know, this is not, I'm in a bad situation. And then that hooks into which part of the rest of us? The nurturing parent. I can help you. I know what you're going through or whatever, right? So indeed, we can see that this is where it goes from adult to starting to shade into a game. So some other, so let me go back a second to our previous game. So what do we get out of it? So the person says, okay, I've got this problem, my kid won't fall asleep. You say, oh, have you tried this? Yes, but that didn't work, or that worked for a week. Well, have you tried such and such? Somebody else jumps in. Oh, yes, but that. So that's why he calls it, why don't you, yes, but. Everybody in the group is now posing solutions, and the person with the problem says, yes, but, and they have some reason to discount it or say, I've tried it, doesn't work. So eventually, the game ends when everyone's exhausted. They can't come up with any other solutions. And the person who posed the problem to begin with enjoys the silence, right? Because now that's the payoff for them, is that I've posed this problem, nobody's been able to solve it for me, and that silence is the payoff. So if somebody's playing this game and they get cut short, somebody else comes in and cuts the game short, diverts it, then they don't get the payoff, and it's not very satisfying. And that's when you can tell that it's a game, is when you get to the point where everybody else in the group is dissatisfied, frustrated, maybe a little irked that this person has been shooting down their ideas, but the person might smile who actually posed the problem, right? It's like, so what existential or life script kinds of position might they be playing this to reinforce? If we were to try to categorize, like, what might be their life script? Again, I'm used to thinking of psychopathology.
Looking for attention.
So it's definitely a way to get attention, the child to wave their hand and say, take care of me, and hook that parent. But as kids, didn't we often maybe find some glee sometimes when parents weren't perfect, when the parent, because we're in a powerless position as a child compared to the parents. So there is some part of our child that likes to see that the parents weren't right after all, that the parents aren't omniscient, right? So part of the satisfaction might be to say, see, you parents don't know it all anyway. You guys aren't, you know. So there's some part of their child that may feel rebellious and feel like, see, you're not everything that you think you are. And maybe at a larger life stage or life script, it's more about, hey, see, problems can't be solved, or my problems can't be solved, or you're not as smart as you think you are,
Yeah,
or whatever.
that's what I was going to say. It builds the person up. The one that's kind of insecure.
Yeah, so it builds the sense of, you know, I may feel insecure, but look, I was able to show that you guys don't know, I've got real problems, you don't know how to solve these. So lots of different sort of underhanded kinds of motives that, now again, people aren't conscious of this or aware of it necessarily, and I guess that's where the whole analysis comes in, to make people more conscious. Some other common games, if it weren't for you or him or her or them, right? So we can imagine at work where maybe this plays out with one coworker saying to another, if it wasn't for my other coworker, if it wasn't for my boss, if it wasn't for my wife, if it wasn't for my husband, if it wasn't for whatever, then I would be happy, I would be more successful, I would, you know, be more efficient at work, whatever the case might be. And so from a psychological perspective, again, what might be the payoff? What does this do for the person who plays this game?
deflects the responsibility.
All right, so now I'm not responsible. Hey, I could really be a high achiever if only these people would, blah, blah, blah. So indeed, it takes them off the hook, right? They can now continue to say it's not me who's the problem, it's these other people. And indeed, he would say that folks who feel that need are going to always find people to quote unquote oppress them because it keeps them from having to take responsibility. They're always going to have a ready excuse for why they're not achieving or being happy or being free or doing whatever they want. So he would even say, like in a marital relationship, that maybe somebody who is afraid to really stick their neck out might choose a partner who is oppressive so that they always have a ready excuse, but they also don't recognize they're getting something out of that. They're being kept from having to take risks by having an oppressive partner in their life to keep them from.
So is that one of the explanations for why people stay in abusive relationships?
Could be for abusive relationships, exactly. It's sort of like Shay's now into things like codependency, right? When we think about a codependent alcoholic kind of relationship or drug abuse, we say, well, the person who's alcoholic or a drug abuser is dependent on their caretaker, but then if it's codependency, the caretaker needs that other person to be somebody who needs taken care of, right? That's how they get their sense of worth, and it can also be used in this way. Well, I take care of you and so therefore I was never able to go back to school because I always had to take care of you because you were always drunk and coming home, right? But it keeps them from having to take a risk, and what if they were to go back to school and not be successful? Or what if they were to go back to school and it turns out not to be what they thought it was going to be? This way they have a ready excuse to say, I would have been happy if I didn't have to take care of you, and not recognize that that's the life position they're taking. Another version here, sort of, look what you made me do. And of course, if you've spent any time around young children, you see that they naturally seem to play this in irrational ways. And that's why a couple of times in my daughter's life when she was young, I would see her play this and I would just laugh out loud because it'd be so ridiculous. I mean, she might be working on something, or I might be across the room and she would spill something or stub her toe, and she'd immediately look at me, and sometimes with angry scowl, other times, you look what you made me do. And it's like, well, I wasn't even there. I'm 10 feet away from you. So we see the irrationality there, but many times when we're adults, it's more sophisticated, and we don't recognize that these folks are, again, blaming other people when they make a mistake, and they can find a way to tag it back to, well, you made me do this, or you put this on my plate and now it blew up, and so really it's not my fault, it's you. And so we can, again, maybe see part of the payoff is not taking responsibility. In other cases, it might be that by me getting all blustery and saying, look what you made me do, I've now put you in a powerless position. You feel badly, and you now owe me or feel deferent to me. It might drive a wedge between us interpersonally so that I don't have to get close to you or treat you nicely because I'm angry at you. You deserve whatever. And there are variations. One of them he calls, now I've got you, you son of a bitch. That, when you really take it to the point where some people are just looking for others to screw up so that they can really lay it to them, and just any little thing they take as a chance to pounce and get that parent out of them, that critical parent. Now, we can flip it around and say some folks are playing I'm only trying to help you, where they're getting involved, maybe sometimes not even invited, but involved in other people's affairs. And then when the other person gets angry or tries something and says, you would see it as a compliment. So maybe the person who's playing I'm only trying to help you says, why don't you do X, Y, and Z? And that person does it, and it doesn't work, or it blows up. And then they say, look what you made me do. But I'm only trying to help you. Right? So they're complementary games, and the person who's playing I'm only trying to help you probably gets a sense of being able to meddle but not feel guilty, because again, I'm only trying to help you. My motives are pure, right? I'm doing it honestly. But it also maybe reinforces for some people their life script that no matter how much you help people, they're always going to be unappreciative, or it's never going to work, or whatever, right? Sort of a sad sack kind of perspective. And we'll end with something that you might have seen if you've been exposed to any of the conscious leadership literature in GHS, the Cartman drama triangle. And so when I was first exposed to this, I said, well, this looks a lot like games people play. And so I did a little background, and indeed, Cartman was a student of Eric Berne and transactional analysis, and just developed this out of that same dynamic. And so we'll spend a moment, I just pulled this offline, online, so it's not that I chose the gender of these people, but whoever made this chose two women as the persecutor and the victim. But let's start at that level. With the persecutor, doesn't necessarily need to be a real persecutor. They're just perceived by the victim as a persecutor. Now, they may actually be somebody who's persecuting, but it may be that the person's not. But the key here is that the victim perceives the persecutor as somebody who's oppressing them, who's being unfair, who's being unreasonable, and so forth. So at that level, the person is playing, why me? Or, if it weren't for you, or those kinds of games in terms of saying, look, you're the problem. If it weren't for you, I'd be able to do X, Y, or Z. So we might even say somebody who's entrenched in that kind of game might do things to entice or coerce the persecutor into playing that role, right? So maybe the persecutor doesn't want to be that way. He or she's not playing that game, but the victim is so entrenched that he or she's going to unintentionally do things or unconsciously do things to make it seem like the other. So let's just, as an example, the persecutor is the boss and the victim is the employee. Maybe the employee is going to do certain things where the ball is dropped and the boss has to come down heavy and say, you really dropped the ball. You're just being unfair, or if it weren't for you, or see what you made me do, or, they're going to have a rationale. So then it feels like, well, you're just being unfair. You're persecuting me. What they don't see is their own role in prompting that response from the persecutor, so that it feels like they're the victim. Now, the way it becomes a triangle, of course, is that the rescuer, some other person, in the case of work, it's probably going to be a coworker, who jumps in and hears the victim side of the story and says, that really does sound unfair. That's crazy. Are you sure that, And so if we talk about the parent-adult child, from what aspect of the personality is the victim probably acting? The child, right? I need rescued. The rescuer comes in as the nurturing parent and says, oh, let me take care of you. That does sound unfair. And so the rescuer might just, again, reinforce and play that nurturing role. It becomes the triangle when the rescuer then tries to intervene and goes to the persecutor and says, well, let me try to fix this. Let me try to solve this. Now, if the rescuer goes to the persecutor and does try to resolve it and realizes, well, this isn't what I heard from the victim, maybe something is fishy here, the rescuer might go back to the victim and say, hey, are you sure that he or she treated you unfairly? Because I checked it out and this seems to be... Now, that's not going to play well with the victim, right? Because the victim isn't about solving the problem. The victim is about playing this game of poor me and if it weren't for you and so forth. So the victim is either going to drop the rescuer and they no longer fit into that person's game, or maybe sometimes the rescuer, after they've tried numerous times to fix it and it doesn't work, because again, it's not going to work. That's not the role or the game of this, the goal of this game. Then they might become frustrated and start to be a little irritated with the victim and sort of slide into that persecutor role. And now they are the bad guy. And some other coworker or other person will slide into the rescuer role and say, yeah, that doesn't sound fair, right? So you sort of slide roles between the persecutor and the rescuer as new rescuers come into it.
So is the persecutor a parent or...
So it would be coming from the critical parent, right? So the victim is seeing the persecutor as, or relating to that person as though they are a critical parent. If the persecutor does play that role, then they are probably playing it from their critical parent perspective. And so indeed, you've got the petulant child interacting with the critical parent, and then the nurturing parent coming in to, save the day, solve the problem, nurture the victim. And when it doesn't work, then maybe again that person leaves and gets tired, or they might become critical and therefore become more of the persecutor, and then another rescuer slides in to fill that void.
So now conscious leadership uses the word villain.
Villain, right.
Villain, victim, and rescuer. I think
Rescuer, yeah. And of course in the conscious leadership, they would say that the rescuer can become a facilitator, and I forget what word they use there, but the idea of like they can help the victim and coach the victim on how to solve the problem directly with the persecutor. Now, Byrne would say if this is a game, that's not going to work because that's not what the victim wants. The victim doesn't want resolution. The victim wants to play the game. And that if the rescuer, in this case the coach, tries to help, the victim's going to resist, push away, play, yes, why don't you, yes, but, and find somebody else to play the rescuer. So for Byrne, he would say the only way to win at one of these games is to recognize it. There's the conscious part of it, become conscious of it, and decide not to play. because by design they're meeting unconscious needs, and people who are entrenched in them, especially if it's a life script, are not going to give them up easily. Now, of course, the whole goal of transactional analysis is to make them conscious so that you can talk to the person adult to adult and hopefully hook into their adult and get them to analyze what's going on and say, I see this is a problem. Now, that's easier said than done, right? But that's the goal, of course, is to make this stuff conscious so that people can choose not to play the victim, not to play the rescuer, or not to play the persecutor.
There's so much more to it than just being conscious of it.
Yeah.
It's choosing to change once you're conscious.
Sure. Like you say, you have to have the motive. You have to have first the insight and the desire to say this is unhealthy or this isn't. And he would say that most folks, we rely on things like the rituals and whatever, and that true intimacy involves always being adult to adult, or when we're child to parent or parent to child or whatever, that we're being conscious of it. And sometimes we do want to be taken care of, and sometimes we want our significant other to be the parent and just let us, right? But that's different when we're doing it consciously than when we're doing it unconsciously with everybody and playing out roles that are inappropriate for the workplace. Or
I think I'd like to be child to child.
And sometimes when people get playful, right, the two people become child to child and just get into a playful mood and get goofy and silly and do fun things together and be impulsive. So indeed, lots of different interaction possibilities. So that's the quick and dirty 20-minute overview of transactional analysis, and again tying it to what we're exposed to here in the conscious leadership. I do have a PDF form of the book. I'm happy to share with folks if you're interested. It's not that long. I want to say it's like 160 pages or something, but send me an email and I'll send it as an attachment. He goes into, of course, much greater detail about different games, and mostly they're about personal relationships, intimate relationships, but certainly many of them apply to work as well. Questions, comments?
I have one question.
Yeah.
The persecutor.
Yeah.
Do you think they're conscious of what they're doing, or you think they're just they want this, they want to be the dictator, rule, or whatever, and they do know, or
Sure. I think there are lots of possibilities. So I think some people do play that role naturally, if you want to call it that way, or that's part of their personality or part of their management style, or what they're getting their needs met that way. So I think those folks certainly attract victims and vice versa, because they complement each other so well. I think there are other times that the person who plays the persecutor role doesn't want to be that, but is being cast that way by the victim, and again is prodded in certain ways to do certain things or react in ways that end up looking that way to the outside world. So I guess it all comes back to how much insight the persecutor has. If he or she keeps trying to hook the victim's adult and say, let's resolve this adult to adult, and feels very frustrated that never seems to get anywhere, I would say that's a sign that indeed the victim is playing a game and not having an actual miscommunication or misunderstanding, because those can be resolved by adult to adult kinds of interactions. So I think in general that should be maybe a warning sign that we're being sucked into a game, is if we feel like we're handling this rationally, but the other person keeps being irrational, or what looks to be irrational to us, or it never gets resolved, right? On one level it feels like it is, but then it just keeps playing itself out again and again. Right. Then it's time to step back and say there's something more going on than a true miscommunication or a true problem that can be solved, adult to adult.
Okay. That was good.
Well, thanks. Let me push record.
People are so complicated.
I recall one of the things that impressed me about that